All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Zach Taylor, and I am here on behalf of the Roads to Freedom Foundation Omaha Unconvention, and I am here with Dr. Mary J. Ruwart, author of the upcoming book, Death by Regulation. And we will be having kind of a discussion about her book and a discussion about the nicer side of libertarianism. But first, Dr. Ruwart, how are you today?
I'm doing just fine, Zach. How about yourself?
I'm very sore. I had to move a fridge, so
I'd be sore too.
so I am not the most well-connected person in this movement right now. So I know of you from David talking about you. Can you describe your involvement in the liberty movement? We've talked about you wrote some books.
Yes.
And you seem to be kind of an expert on libertarian healthcare. How did you come into that?
Well, when I was in college, I read Ayn Rand's books and got very excited about that. And then several years later, I saw an ad in Reason magazine for the Libertarian Party that was starting up. So I answered it. I never heard anything back, but eventually I found the party again in the early 80s and joined and started running for different offices. And it was really an eye-opener because, nobody knew what we were back then. They called us librarians. And we were the only ones talking about things like eliminating the IRS and ending the war on drugs and gay rights. And there's been a lot of progress on those things since then. So I'm very, very happy about that. I actually got involved in running for the presidential nomination in 1983. Mostly to just suggest we should run a woman at the top of the ticket, not necessarily me. And then again in 2008. So I've been involved in national politics and the local level. I've served on the LNC. I'm currently chair of Liberty International, which used to be International Society for Individual Liberty before the acronym ISIL became a dirty word. So I've done a lot of different things in the movement. And of course, I've written several books. Healing Our World, The Compassion of Libertarianism is probably what I'm best known for. I did a column for 20 years for the Advocates for Self-Government called Short Answers to the Tough Questions. I have a book on that. And finally, of course, the new book that's coming out on April 10th is Death by Regulation, How We Were Robbed of a Golden Age of Health and How We Can Reclaim it. And this is a very different book. It talks about my involvement in consulting for the nutraceutical industry, being a researcher in the pharmaceutical industry, and watching as our medical paradigm was shifted from inexpensive prevention to expensive treatment. And I go through in the book, in Death by Regulation, some of this. And I'm running a special right now because we want to put it on the Amazon bestseller list. So anyone who orders it at deathbyregulation.us before April 9th will get about $60 worth of free gifts. And what we'll do on April 10th is we'll input all those orders on Amazon and see if we can shoot it up to the bestseller list. And that way we will really get an opportunity to show people, especially non-libertarians, that bad law and bad regulations can be just as deadly as bad drugs. And I'm hopeful for the prospects of this book because whether we're regulators or pharmaceutical executives, whether we're patients, doctors, or just an ordinary person, we really want to understand these regulations, which have shaved an average of 5 to 10 years off each of our lives. And no one wants that. So I'm very hopeful that this demonstration of how deadly these regulations are will get people to sit up and take notice regardless of their political affiliation and hopefully do away with these regulations.
Awesome. So the reason you're here on the Unconvention channel is you will be speaking at the Unconvention. We don't have the exact time slot yet for your speech, but we have a really robust I just lost the word, medical, like Liberty Medical Track with, there's you, there's Dr. Kyle Varner, Dr. Lee Heeb, I believe. So this is actually this and crypto are our two big like pushes. What is it about the medical industry or the pharmaceutical industry that makes it such an important issue for libertarians? Because it feels like it's the most important a lot of the time.
Well, all of us are affected by it, for one thing. And as libertarians, we've known it's terrible because the government's so involved. We know it means bad stuff is happening. But until recently, it's been really hard to quantitate that. And that's what death by regulation does. There's been so many studies on the pharmaceutical industry that you can actually calculate how many people have lost how many years of their lives to these regulations, and really just a segment of the regulations. And in my book, I just talk about the numbers of people that have died because drugs, these regulations added 10 years to the process that drugs must go through to get from the lab bench to the marketplace. And then, of course, innovation has been squashed. About 50 to 80% of our pharmaceutical innovations are not available to the American public and therefore the world. And so it's easy to make that calculation. What's not so easy is to figure out how much we've lost because these amendments also really inhibited censored, maybe is the better word, censored life-saving information about prevention. I wish I could calculate that. I believe it to be even bigger than the impact on the pharmaceutical industry and the drugs. And so to get a feel for this, as I said in the beginning, each of us have lost about 5 to 10 years of our lives to these amendments. And the number's probably even bigger than that because I'm giving you a conservative estimate. The exciting thing about putting numbers on this is that it's kind of a wake-up call for everyone because even the FDA regulators are affected by this. And so I think it's maybe one place where libertarians can really point and say, hey, this is hurting all of us. Let's change it.
Yeah, definitely. So something that we started getting here in Nebraska, there is a clinic down in Lincoln, I believe Lincoln, that in order to get away from the insurance industry, they have started doing like a gym membership essentially, where you pay monthly dues and you go in and you get your basic health care taken care of, and then they have packages where you I need an X-ray, so I'm going to pay way below market value because insurance has driven up the rates, and that's something we talked to Dr. Varner about. Are there any other solutions like that you see?
Oh, yes. Health Excellent Plus was started by a couple libertarians, Jeff Cantor and Charles Fromm. And it's actually similar to that. It's kind of, you pay a monthly or annual fee and you get certain services. And the way they've been able to keep the costs very, very low is they've contracted with different doctors and clinics to give their services in an economical way because they're going to be paid directly as opposed to actually having to fight with the insurance company. So the amount's much lower. And so there's ways now that we can shop carefully.
So is that would you say that's like an uninsurance company that
yeah, I guess you could put it that way. I really suggest that if you have listeners who are interested in finding a lower priced option to health insurance, they check it out. Health Excellence Plus.
Okay.
And you can just type it into the Google search engine. It'll come right on top of the page.
Cool. I just had a thought. What was it? Oh no. Oh, so Dr. Varner talked about he spends more than half of his time doing paperwork for insurance companies rather than seeing patients. Would you say that that's fairly universal?
Yes, most doctors actually in their offices, they have a person that does nothing but that. And actually one of my sisters did that for her doctor's office. And it's quite if it's a big office, there's more than one person. So, it's very time consuming, especially, of course, dealing with the government insurance companies like Medicare and Medicaid.
Yeah. I can so I have to use the VA because I'm both disabled and poor. So it's kind of just that for me. And I imagine that I see a bunch of doctors there that never leave the rooms that they're working in whenever I go to visit. And I assume that it's just paperwork for them.
Possibly, it's interesting because that's one of the sad things is, we promise our service people that they will get this wonderful health care. And then, of course, since it's provided by government, sometimes that doesn't happen.
So sometimes you are being very generous.
Well, I have known vets that have been very pleased with their VA service. So, I mean, it just depends. I mean, it's like anything else. I'm sure there are good sites and bad sites.
Well, so for me, I'm terrible about understanding people with accents. So maybe it's not the same in all the other sites, but in Omaha, they use a lot of Indian doctors, which I'm sure they're wonderful at their job, but I can't understand most of them.
Yeah, this is an issue. Our medical licensing laws are so stringent that we've actually created a big doctor shortage here. So we're kind of importing doctors and other healthcare workers too. I understand nurses are also being imported. And it's very sad because there's many people who'd like to help out. In fact, when I was in college, we had, people coming back from Vietnam who had been doing the surgery basically on the battlefield. They had done things that, you can't even change a bedpan here almost without a license. But, back then they were doing surgery and all kinds of things. And I remember talking to one guy who had done field surgery. And of course, he wasn't able to even get a job changing bedpans back then because he didn't have the appropriate credentials, even though he was quite a good surgeon. So it's crazy.
Yeah, I've never understood, so if you're a military police, you can't immediately transition to normal police, because it's different licensing. The 68 whiskeys, which is the medics, can't immediately become a paramedic.
No.
Have to go through, I don't understand. You're taking people from the most extreme, most stressful part of the field and saying, well, you can't come back here and do the arguably easier parts of the field. You need more training. What are you going to train them to do that they haven't already done under fire before?
Exactly. Well, of course, the regulations generally are not really there to protect the consumer.
Right.
That's what we're told. What they actually are doing is creating a monopoly or cartel for the people who are already in the system, so to speak, so that they don't have to worry about competition. And that's very sad. And that's what's created a lot of our healthcare problems, because healthcare is probably the most regulated area in all of our nation. And of course, healthcare costs are up. Quality is limited. The amount of care you can get is limited. That's why when you go to the doctor, in general, you have somebody who spends 10 minutes with you and then moves on. And that's very sad. That's not the way it used to be. And it's not the way it should be.
Right. So how do we talk to people about that? Because it seems like whenever you bring up healthcare, especially Democrats will say, well, we need more government regulation. And it's like, how can you get more? There's not a whole lot more you can regulate other than we're going to price control everything, which is going to lead to just terrible, terrible things.
Well, I think part of the problem is there is a misunderstanding among the public that regulations mean more safety and higher quality. So that's one of the things I got very enthused about when I started working on the data for the book I wrote, Death by Regulation. And I wrote it because not too many people have the background to write this kind of book. And what I saw as a libertarian, of course, was that these regulations were harming people. But now that some studies have been done, like I said, you can actually calculate the numbers. You ask what we can do to wake people up. And I think one of the things we can do is show them the numbers. I mean, when you realize that each of us have lost 5 to 10 years of our lives to these regulations, that's a big wake-up call. And like I said, it influences the FDA regulators, the pharmaceutical executives, everybody. So I think the secret here in getting people to understand is to show that regulations can be just as bad and just as deadly as bad drugs. And that's what I try to do in this book. So I'm hoping it will be a wake-up call, because most people think regulations equal protection, consumer protection. And what we need to show, and I think we can show it now, at least in the pharmaceutical industry, that's not necessarily true.
Okay. So we've managed to go, actually, where I had it here, we've managed to go quite a ways without bringing up marijuana. So kudos to us. But now let's kind of talk about that a little bit. It's gaining a lot of steam and a lot of stuff. Like, we're in Nebraska. I've always said we will be the last state to legalize anything. Kind of walk me through this. How effective do you think marijuana legalization so far has been, medically speaking?
Oh, I think it's made great strides. What's happening in the states that have legalized medical marijuana, there's a lot of information coming out on how helpful cannabis can be. And, you know, it's kind of interesting, because if cannabis was legal, and if there were the usual types of studies to make a health claim, you know, the FDA requires you, if you want to make a health claim, to go through roughly 12 to 14 years of regulatory red tape. So if cannabis was legal, it would actually be in that system now, probably, before any health claims could be made. You could use it, but you couldn't talk about it if you were a manufacturer. But now, because of the way the legalization of it is coming about, you know, people can go ahead and go to their you know, whichever places are selling it, and get quite a bit of information that they normally wouldn't have been able to get without going through these regulations. So in a sense, the regulations have backfired on themselves when legalization has happened. So that's been one of the big benefits, is we've actually gotten some information from a lot of these dispensaries, which hasn't normally happened in the past. I mean, one of the things, you know, when the AIDS crisis happened, maybe I should just mention to your listeners, because they may be somewhat familiar with this, the AIDS patients actually went to black market chemists and tried to distribute the drugs that we were working on in the pharmaceutical industry. And they were successful in doing that. By the time the FDA gave us permission as pharmaceutical companies, us I say, because I was in the industry at the time, you know, by the time we were permitted to do human studies, every AIDS patient in the country had already had our drugs and was resistant. And, you know, the Dallas Buyers Club, you know, that popular movie, award-winning movie, showed what happened to some of these people who tried to help the AIDS patients stay alive. They were prosecuted and persecuted unless they were well connected enough to be able to create such a media storm that the FDA didn't dare touch them.
Yeah. So, So, in a rare good Trump moment, our honorable president was talking about right to try.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you see that going? Because, you know, anytime, in my mind, anytime the government tries to do something like that, they're going to botch it. So.
Well, actually, it's kind of already, well, right to try is basically the same legislation that the cancer patients tried to get passed by going and taking the FDA to court. They asked for permission for the terminally ill to be able to take drugs that were not yet approved by the FDA, and they said that was their constitutional right. And the courts eventually ruled that, no, we do not have the constitutional right to save our lives with unapproved drugs. So this is the same legislation that failed at the legal level, and it's been passed state by state. It's now in the U.S. Congress. But the problem with it is that it requires the drugs that are used in right to try to stay in the FDA's good graces. Now, the FDA is probably going to get very upset at the drug companies that actually negotiate one-on-one with these terminally ill patients and give them their drugs. So the pharmaceutical companies are going to be afraid to do that, because the FDA can drag its feet on their approvals and make their life pretty miserable. So I don't think it's going to have a lot of traction, even if it passes. But I want to share with your listeners, there's hope. The Heartland Institute is going to be promoting shortly a very similar program, except that once the drugs get in the right to try track, they no longer have to stay in FDA's good graces. It'll be literally 2 separate tracks. So I think right to try is paving the way for an understanding that some reform is needed. I hope it passes just because I think it's better than nothing and some people will benefit. But coming on its heels is going to be free to choose medicine, which is going to be a 2-track system, a true track system. And of course, it's more conservative than my suggestion, which is that we not require FDA approval to market drugs. So I'm hoping that my book will make free to choose medicine or right to try look conservative and increase their chances of passing.
Is there a worse government agency than the FDA?
As far as I can tell, the FDA is the most deadly of the agencies, even more so than the Department of Defense, because just for the people who die waiting, more than 10 times the number of people who have died in wars, all American wars, from the very inception of our country, have died because of the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Act. 10 times. And that's just that die waiting for a new drug to be put on the market. I'm not even counting the ones that never make it to the market. I'm not even counting all the preventative measures that have been suppressed because of these amendments. So the 1960s
and all the times that they go out there and start telling everyone to eat a ton of sugar instead of
I haven't even
proteins.
I haven't even calculated that. So although of course that's substantial. So I mean, I really have a very conservative estimate of how deadly the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Act were. These are the regulations that gave the FDA its teeth, so to speak, and they metastasize every year. So every year it gets worse. So if we don't stop them, pretty soon we won't have any drugs and any prevention at all.
So I don't know anything about. Oh, I'm getting that. Go, hang on. Testing. Okay, it's mostly gone. So I don't know a whole lot about the 1962 thing that you're talking about. I can assume that it was probably some lobbying group decided to pay off a bunch of people to get a bill passed.
Well, actually,
but can you explain what you're talking about a little bit more?
Sure. Well, in 1962, there was a drug in Europe called thalidomide. And what happened is it started out as a safer alternative to barbiturates as a sleeping drug. And for adults, it was safer. But unfortunately, some women started taking it because it prevented morning sickness, and the companies started marketing it for that. But because there's a big time lag between the time you take it and the time you realize there's a problem when the baby's born, it took a while for them to figure out that, hey, this drug was very deadly to the unborn. It either killed it or the babies came out missing some limbs if the thalidomide was taken in the first 2 months of pregnancy. So this wasn't approved. Yeah, it wasn't approved in the US. The FDA examiner wasn't approving it for other reasons, but when Life magazine started showing pictures of these babies, the people, I guess the American public, felt like something needed to be done. And these amendments had been languishing in Congress for a long time. And so the Congress just glommed onto them and passed them. They were never designed to make drugs safer, and they didn't. In fact, the withdrawal rate of drugs that have been approved and then had to be taken off the market actually increased slightly after the amendments. So it didn't help safety, and it didn't help effectiveness, which was its actual intent, was to help make sure ineffective drugs didn't get on the market. There may have been maybe a 10% increase in drug effectiveness, but it increased costs 40-fold. So that's huge. That's why our pharmacy costs are so high, because they're directly related. I show the graph in my book. They're directly related to the amount of money that the companies have to pay to get through the regulatory process.
Okay.
That goes up every year, so do prices.
Mm-hmm. So to kind of back up a little bit into what you were just saying, you were talking about the media outlets started showing pictures of these, these tragic cases with these children. Why do we not do that better when it comes to like an 8-year-old, what was that person's name? We had him at our rally in Lincoln. But you know, children who are having seizures or having all these medical conditions that they can't get the treatments that they need. The drug companies want to hit them with these ultra powerful medications that just turn them into a zombie. Like, why are we not effective at getting those pictures out to people? Like, what's the disconnect for us?
Well, I think understandably, many libertarians come into the movement because they've had, they've been stomped on by government. And so they take all this very personally, which is understandable. But what we need to recognize is that when you're trying to sell anything, whether it's a product or an idea, you really have to show people what's in it for them, right? And so, if you don't do that, you're probably not going to sell it. And to do that, we really have to have a little more empathy with other people because, if we don't have that, it's very difficult to tell them how this is going to benefit them. But I think that's one of the most wonderful things about liberty that we've really, I guess, underutilized is the fact that liberty gives almost everyone what they really want. It creates universal prosperity, gives us a peaceful world, makes discrimination less. Even though it seems counterintuitive to say all these things, it actually also increases the distribution of wealth. So, most people don't realize that liberty really works. It works because it is right. And as libertarians, we often emphasize the fact that liberty is right. But, if you think about it for a moment, if we believed in the morality of liberty, but it gave us more poverty, a dirtier environment, a warring world. If it actually took years off our lives, we wouldn't want that. And when we talk about liberty in the moral sense, it's a wonderful thing. But what we have to do is make sure people know that it's two sides of the same coin. The moral and the practical are two sides of the same coin. If we don't do that, I think we're missing the most important selling point of liberty, which is that it works. And that's why we have to, if we really want liberty to work for us, we have to make it work for other people. So in a sense, we really have to develop that empathy and we have to develop the concern for our neighbor so that we can actually help them understand. And that's kind of a win-win thing because I think when we look at other people in an empathic way, in a compassionate way, I think it does something inside of us that's very positive and helps us go from being a pessimist about how things are going to more of being an optimist.
Yeah, definitely. So you had a previous book, and I just lost it. So Healing Our World. Yeah.
The compassion of libertarianism. Yeah.
What can you talk about that a little bit? Because like the cover that I'm seeing is kind of reminiscent of 9/11.
That was the 2003 edition. Yes. What happened? I've had 4 editions, and I've changed the subtitle every time. So the 2003 edition was Healing Our World in an Age of Aggression. It showed the Twin Towers, and the idea there was to show that there was a way to change that outcome and change the way that that we see the world after that. And so in this latest version, Healing Our World, the Compassion of Libertarianism, I use that subtitle because people are getting the impression that libertarianism is a big selfish thing where people don't care about other people. And this is a sad impression that we've given, I think, others, or that they've used kind of as a weapon against us, if you will, because of course, the beauty of libertarianism is even if its practitioners are not compassionate, the outcome of a libertarian world is. And that's, I think, very important. It helps to enrich the poor. It helps to protect the environment, deter crime, and diffuse terrorism. And so those are the results of a libertarian ethic. And that's really compassion for all.
So before we went live, we were talking about kind of marketing libertarianism from a more compassionate, emotional place. Why do you think libertarians, and not all, because there's some that don't do this. Why are libertarians so bad at it generally, though? Like, especially in the light of certain members going out recently and just making some really hard to swallow statements that don't seem to reflect a good personal nature.
Well, I mean, without getting specific, it's kind of hard to address that. But as I said earlier, I think a lot of people entered the movement because they were harmed by government. And so there's a certain sometimes bitterness there, and an entry into the movement to fix their own problems, which is certainly understandable. But those problems don't stop with us as individuals. They're something that's universal. And that's, I think, we need to take that extra step and recognize that even though we see the horrible impact of government on our own lives, we need to appreciate that other people are going through this too. And that if we want to convince them that liberty is going to make their life better, then we need to look at their lives and say, okay, so this is the problem you're having, and this is how liberty solves it. Because if we don't address their concerns, it's hard for them to see anything but what our detractors call us: selfish, greedy, things like this. And that's just not the case.
Definitely. So I've kind of gone through all of my questions. I will say I'm looking forward. I just got booked to go do tabling down at the Texas Libertarian Convention. So I actually get to come meet you, and we're really we're going to try to ninja our way into inviting Eric July to come speak, because we haven't really been able to get a hold of him up until now. So it's our super secret plan. So what would you like to leave people with? What are your closing thoughts?
Well, obviously, one of the things that's near and dear to my heart right now is trying to get a lot of press for Death by Regulation. So I'd like to encourage your listeners to go to deathbyregulation.us. And if they like what they see, to buy a copy of the book at that site, so that on April 10th, we can input all the orders into Amazon at one time and make it a bestseller. And the gift that I want to give your listeners to help with this is that there are $60 worth of free bonuses that come with that purchase. So hopefully that will, get some excitement up and make it worth their while to buy the book. Also, if you go to my website, ruwart.com, that's RUWART.com, just like my name. I have a free library where there's lots of great free stuff, videos and audios and papers that I've written. And some of those might help your listeners do things like talk about how liberty helps the poor, helps the environment, and a number of other topics that a lot of libertarians don't feel that they're good at talking about. Since I came from the left, I am very sensitive to these issues, and I think I do a fairly decent job of showing people how to approach those groups so that they can, speak with them intelligently and in a way that gets their interest up. Also, of course, on my website, you can read for free the 1993 edition of Healing Our World. And of course, if you want to, you can buy the 2015 edition. But, the 2003 edition, the 1993 edition pretty much, gives your listeners a pretty good idea of how to handle some of these issues. And basically, Healing Our World goes step by step with the libertarian philosophy, but doesn't really talk much about rights. It talks more about what works and why it works, and deals again with the issues that many libertarians that come from the right have a difficult time addressing.
Okay. Well, for Dr. Mary Ruwart, I'm Zach Taylor for the Omaha Unconvention. Everyone have a wonderful